Chapter 38. Gregory opened his window to the moist, humid night air, full of the mosquitoes and other creatures that did not bother him anymore, and then he returned to his bed, where he sat down on his relatively new fur blankets, propped himself up against a few pillows, and lit the lamp nearest to him. When he was in a foul mood already to begin with, the smallest thing could set him off further. This time, it was the memory of his ancient gray Confederate government-issued blanket that had torn right in half a few years back as he had first moved in and had been making his bed. For the past several decades, the rough gray thing had been fraying ominously at the edges until it came to resemble an oddly shaped rag that a homeless vagrant might sniff twice at before even considering covering himself with it. This is the passage of time, Gregory told himself. Everything fades. Everything breaks. Everything goes to ruin. In the contest between his nostalgia and his love of clean and beautiful things, nostalgia had long ago won out. But eventually, at the thought that he would have to cover himself with 2 separate rips of an old blanket, he had resigned himself to its fate as lining his garbage bin. I once knew a pretty little seamstress who could probably sew this thing back together, he remembered thinking. But even now, several years on, he hurriedly slammed down the gate on the place in his mind where such thoughts led. It didn't matter. No seamstress could have taken his old Confederate garbage and turned it into a new blanket again. It would have taken an act of alchemy, not sewing. There was no helping it. He had had to resign himself to its going. Another fragile piece of his past was irreparably gone. Well, you can't take it all away, he huffed stubbornly to himself, as he hauled out from under his bed one of the boxes full of his journals. I can call up the past any time I want, like a conjurer or like an occultist can call up spirits. He reached his hand in, avoiding any of the journals tied about with a thin red ribbon, and he pulled one out. The red ribbons were a kind of warning flag and indicated which journals had anything in them about Vivian. It had been some time since he had dared to open one of those. At least, he hadn't read one while sober in a very long time, and he was not about to do so now. This journal that he had selected was from 1950, and then the one after it was from 1950 to 1951, and then the one beside that was from 1952, and so forth. For someone who had determined to emotionally and physically retire from the world, it had actually been a busy decade thus far. He had returned from his time in Rio and discovered that there was another war going on, this time in Korea. Ferdinand filled him in on the details on the flight back to New York. I know you are all patriotism, ever ready to be set ablaze, you warrior priest, but I'm informing you now that I am sitting this one out, Ferdinand told him point blank. At least I want a decade off between my stints of active duty, being shot at and all the rest. This is getting a bit too frequent for me. I feel like we just came back from the last war. I suppose if they still need me come 1955, they can have me then, he added grudgingly. Gregory did not give him much resistance. As traumatized as he still was by his personal problems in the past year, he could not muster in himself the necessary sense of greater duty to want to do anything, much less to enlist again. Still, it bothered him. Is it not uncomfortable for you to walk about with your youthful face, and everyone seeing you and wondering why you are not in uniform and not doing your part?" Gregory asked Ferdinand. "It is a hardship to not be able to explain oneself in regards to this, don't you find?" Ferdinand shrugged. "I haven't given it much thought," he said. "What others think does not take up much of my attention. Why should I care?" He unloaded Gregory in New York City, and after a few evenings visiting with Gregory and Wolf at Wolf's place, he flew off again. Gregory, meanwhile, had come back to New York, determined to leave it, loudly blaming the climate and the chaos and the noise and the smell of the city. But it was really fear that drove him away, an unshakable terror that fate would propel either Vivian or Sophie into his shins again, despite his keeping away and not seeking them out. And why not keep away? He had loved them both until he had worn himself out with it. Everyone deserves a respite from the fire at some point, he thought. Wolf did not look at all surprised when Gregory said he wanted to leave the city. The only comment he made was that it seemed wise. Then he asked where Gregory was thinking of moving to. "To Florida," Gregory told him. "Ah, I see. Natürlich. And you have given this some thought, yeah?" inquired Wolf. "I have," said Gregory definitively. "Well, there is only one drawback that I can see, Gregor, and that is that I cannot imagine what use you will have for your lovely fur-lined suit that I gave you once. Leave it here for when you come to visit me," said Wolf. "You will stay here?" Gregory asked. "Come too. Florida is very nice." Wolf smiled. "Gregor, I cannot keep up with your restless spirit or your passionate heart. New York is a wonderful city for someone of my interests, and the store is doing very well here. My own acquisition of books has taken on entirely new dimensions, just down the road from the major auction houses. I find I am enjoying it, more than I thought I would when I first arrived. I will stay here for a while longer." Wolf helped arrange for the packing of Gregory's apartment, in exchange for which Gregory promised to come and help when Wolf would finally be ready to move from his own apartments at the Carlisle Hotel, or to move the store to a new location. All of Gregory's items went into storage, and then on Wolf's suggestion, they took a trip to Europe, where Gregory spent time with Wolf and Dieter, before Wolf had to return to his store. They sat once more in Dieter's library in Munich and spoke long into the night about world affairs. "This last war really set us back badly in Germany," Dieter complained. "Now that the country is split in two, everything takes twice as long, is twice as expensive, and we have double the bureaucracy. Some new friends of mine live in Berlin now, and you cannot even imagine the unreasonableness of that setup. I really thought about leaving München every single day after the war ended. Everything was so ruined and so unrecognizable, and the loss of so much history felt like a personally sustained physical injury. I saw most of those structures go up, you know. Going through the city, it was like walking among the corpses of one's friends. But help was needed, and I wanted to offer what assistance I could before moving away. And then I did not move away after all, because I began to feel invested in this new city that was coming into shape around me. We lost so many landmarks and so much beautiful architecture, but at least the city has kept going. But Berlin has lost its soul." "Well, you have put things to right here now, friend. Why not come to New York for a while?" Wolf had suggested. "Perhaps, Wolfgang, perhaps," said Dieter, with a shrug of his shoulders, but his eyes betrayed a spark of interest as he looked over at Wolf. "I suppose my laboratory is in good hands at the moment. I have a very capable director in place there just now, but this is one of my on decades, you know. Dieter only works directly in the laboratory after a decade-long pause and after having to make swaps in his technical team, explained Wolf to Gregory. This is the drawback of having a complicated enterprise that one person alone cannot really run. I have suggested the book repair trade to Dieter many times instead, but he remains unconvinced. No one would want to buy the books I have had a go at, laughed Dieter. I admire you tremendously, Wolfgang, but I myself am far too impatient for such work. And yet you've been waiting decades for a breakthrough against tuberculosis, Wolf pointed out. That is true, but that is only because I have no other alternative there. It is a stubborn and infinitely complicated ailment, but it cannot withhold its secrets from science forever. We forge ever onward, said Dieter. Are you also still living in New York, Gregor? Only just. I have put my things into storage, have come over here to play tourist for a while, and then I plan to move down to Florida. Northern living is not for me, said Gregory. Not for you? Asked Dieter. He seemed interested by the fact that Gregory and Wolf were to part ways. Why, I thought that you were the one who convinced Wolfgang to move there. If I recall, there was a young... Ach du lieber Himmel, this has all become so dull. Dieter, do let's have a round of billiards now, interrupted Wolf loudly. I still believe you cheated in that last round we played, and if there's something that I cannot stand, it is to be cheated, and by a German, too. And you, my longtime friend, have you no shame? Now look here, if you're going to make all of us turn our pockets inside out before we start, to make sure that no one has an unpermitted extra ball, began Dieter. And they were off, arguing together in their friendly and jovial way, and with Dieter gallantly holding the door so that his older friend could step through it first. What a good man Wolf is, and how extremely good he has been to me, thought Gregory. Even in small things, he is kind and protective of me, and how little I have really appreciated it, imagining that kindness from a man must somehow be worth only a fraction of such care from a woman. Gregory wished that Wolf would have agreed to stay longer, but after only 2 more weeks, it was time for his return trip to New York. Gregory and Dieter saw him off at the dock, with Dieter teasing Wolf that he had better come to terms with air travel before ship voyages became so antiquated that they were only done as reenactments in historically themed motion pictures. Then Gregory spent a few more days with Dieter before he got ready to say his goodbye. Wait, I have a gift for you before you go, Gregor, said Dieter. He handed Gregory a paper-wrapped bundle that looked like it was a purchase from a department store. Gregory had never been handed anything that looked like it. What is it? Asked Gregory. He pulled off the paper, and inside was a strange piece of small, black luggage. It had a tag attached to it. It is a lunch container. It keeps soups warm for hours. Dieter, I'm sorry, but I do not have lunch on most days, and I haven't had soup since the last century, cold or warm. Dieter laughed. I'm not suggesting that you train your digestion to take up soup once again, but this lunch container is a scientific marvel. It keeps things warm for a long time, but it also keeps things cold exceedingly well, especially if you replenish the ice which goes in here. He opened the container and showed Gregory how it all worked. This material was born of the genius of marvelous engineers, said Dieter, speaking proudly as a scientist in favor of the work of his peers. Keeping materials cold allows us to become travelers to places that we might otherwise fear to visit because of the sparseness of the population in some of the world's outposts. Now do you understand? Gregory nodded slowly. He couldn't imagine wanting to go to any remote places. In fact, he couldn't really imagine wanting anything, or being very curious about anywhere. But Dita went on. I have a very good contact in Copenhagen, who in turn has contacts in the other major Scandinavian capitals. Have you seen much of those lands, Gregor? Beauty beyond description. The fjords, the mountains, the cold air. You should go before you return for America. Thank you so kindly for this gift, then, said Gregory. I thought you were gifting me a lunchbox. But here you tell me that you have in fact given me a passport to the far ends of the world. He smiled. Dita also smiled. You are a very handsome man when you smile, he said. I think Wolfgang is right about you. You are all right. You just need some retuning of your strings. Go and see the northern lights, and if that does not light a fire in you, you must be beyond all reach of nature and inspiration. Gregory packed away the cool storage container with his luggage, waved goodbye to Dita, who had come to see him off at the train station, and then Gregory journeyed further into Luxembourg and Belgium, and then France. This was not the same Europe from before the Great War, or even the Europe from just before the last war. Dita was right. There was so much rebuilding going on that Gregory wondered if the continent would even be recognizable when it was all done. Gregory thought of Anastasia, and even half-considered going to the cemetery outside of Vaduz to pay his respects to the empty box of dirt that Wolf had once buried there. Well, the war had made everyone do insane things. Gregory would wake up now in these strange hotels sometimes and wonder where and when in time he was. He played tourist in France, revisiting every key attraction. He went out to Mont Saint-Michel, and then went to stare at the Bayeux Tapestry, wondering if one day the world of his childhood would be as lost in the remote past as this, as these two-dimensional figures stitched into fabric, and strange people of the future would come to stare at the relics from his own past as if they were from a time that preceded civilization. He went south and stopped in every cathedral of note, from Rouen to Marseille. He went to Strasbourg and sat in the Maison Cammerzahl restaurant, where he unwisely attempted to replace alcohol with coffee, and drank 3 cups of strong black coffee so fast that it made him all jittery and slightly sick. He went to Paris and joined a caravan of Canadian tourists as they were shepherded through the Louvre by a bespectacled young Frenchman with a nasally twang who was serving as their tour guide. He did not make it to the end of that tour, because when the group came upon Canova's statue of Eros and Psyche embracing, Gregory suddenly felt his insides threaten to rip out, and he staggered back outside into the sunshine of the afternoon. Yes, of course that statue was here. How could he have ever forgotten it? Even here, in this country, where Vivian had never been, her memory could not be entirely eradicated. He spent the next days drinking rather more heavily than was judicious, and then he took up his tourist's cloak once more and took himself off to Versailles to see what had changed there since his last visit. He found it not very much changed, which soothed him. Perhaps this was a becalmed section of river that the raging current of time somehow did not course through. If yes, how rare a thing that was, like a flower pressed between the pages of a book, dead and flattened, but still intact in color and shape. He spent longer outside the palace than inside it, feeling the late autumn wind in his face and watching the strutting of the peacocks around the fountains, and the ridiculousness of tourists with cameras running around behind them trying to get a picture. My mother would have given anything to be one of these tourists, to have been able to see these gardens for herself, he thought. Why did I not return from the war and immediately try to bring her here? Then he remembered that he had lacked the money at that time, and that air travel had not yet been invented, and of course voyages by ship were awful back then. And then, like any true nostalgist, as he reached this thought about how something in the past was not as good as it was now, his thinking shut down, and a vague emotional irritation rose up in him instead. It seemed as if a cloud had come over the afternoon suddenly, although the thin, late autumn sun was still bright, if cool, in the sky, and Gregory did not understand why his glumness had been so suddenly reawakened. Overall, it was soothing, though, being a tourist. He had a role to play. It was not a particularly tiresome one. Nothing was expected of him. He was not called upon to engage in small talk if he did not want to, and there were things to look at and listen to that kept his mind occupied, or at least disrupting his easily triggered tendency to brood. Unlike in Rio de Janeiro, he understood the language here, and spoke it also, although he quickly gathered that there had been some changes in the colloquial vocabulary since the dusty, archival French that his tutor had taught him in the years before the war between the states. When he spoke, Frenchmen raised their eyebrows, and French ladies smiled as if it was charming that he sounded like the French equivalent of Shakespeare. He had forgotten much of his French, of course, and it had begun to fade with disuse, but as this education had been laid down before his memory had started to grow porous, he could still get around with relative ease. Sometimes he sat in Parisian cafes and closed his eyes and listened to everyone speaking around him. It reminded him of the woman he had lived with once, the only one. She had always spoken only in French with him, because it was easier for her, and because it was part of her mystique to do so, and because she insisted on always having everything on her terms, so that she could hold power over him, knowing full well that he had a foreign speaker's handicap with French. He woke up in the dark, after his couple hours of rest, which were shortening now over the years, to where he soon might be like Wolf and not sleep at all. And he thought about what Dieter had said about the northern lights, and he wondered what it would be like to see them. No, of course he didn't really care, but it would be good to go, if even just to write a polite note to Dieter about having seen them. For some reason, Gregory did not want to admit to his stirrings of curiosity. He left France, got to Copenhagen, and went to call on Dieter's contact, who turned out to be a very nice middle-aged man who said that he worked with Dieter's laboratory staff. He said he had been told to provide Gregory with a certain number of packets ready for transfusion and to ask no questions. So he was going to ask no questions. Gregory was surprised at this, but the man said that as far as he was concerned, Dieter was a hero for his scientific work, and if Dieter told him to find the end of the world and jump off, he would do so without any questions asked. Have I ever done anything of such admirable content and importance? Thought Gregory. In that moment, he was almost jealous of Dieter. I have drunk too much, and thought too much, and felt too much, and cared too much, and lived inside of my own head too much, all while this man has become a true hero to others. It was a sobering thought. Gregory thanked the man, and then he packed up his new supplies and went to the far north in Scandinavia, where the cold was strangely soothing also. It was as if his natural emotional state needed the warmth and humidity of Louisiana to exist, but that it could be tempered by exposure to deep cold, like in his childhood. His mother had reduced their childhood rashes by applying cold compresses. Dita's magic cool storage container worked as promised. Although it could not, of course, be a permanent replacement for his actual way of life, Gregory had never realized how freeing it was to be able to take care of his needs for a few days at a time from the soft warmth of his hotel bed or his bed on the train, rather than cajoling and misleading others or running through the cold dark in order to find his satisfaction. Ice and snow were everywhere in ample abundance, so refilling the cooling capacity of his container was no trouble. In Helsinki, where he stocked up on more supplies from a man who the first man had recommended to him, someone in a bar told him how the most magical northern lights were up at the Arctic Circle, so he got himself a guide and journeyed north by train. The reindeer looked up at the train as it passed, their eyes full of resignation and calm. "It's cold here," they seemed to say. "That is just how it is. We go on with dignity as best we can, and try not to shiver." Gregory imagined how it might be to bring back a small herd of reindeer to wander the woods around Tonle Desiree. But then that reminded him that he still hadn't sold the place, and that his lawyer was awaiting a reply back to another offer from someone to purchase Gregory's remaining land. "I will think about that when I return back to America," he thought, eager to put the thought of a final sale out of his mind. Dita turned out to be right. The northern lights were so heart-shatteringly perfect and mysterious that Gregory had the brief, awestruck thought of living there forever just to see them every night. But then the guide told him that the northern lights did not appear every night, so on the days when they did not appear, Gregory would have frozen and suffered and lived off of diverted supplies for nothing. It seemed like a bad deal. He went back south. He took a ship across the Gulf of Bothnia and into Stockholm, where he spent about a week sitting in the old town center and warming his hands on one hot cup of glögg after another during the day, and going back to his regular dietary habits again by night. From there, he decided to go to Copenhagen by way of Oslo. In Copenhagen, the sight of the sculpture of the Little Mermaid in the harbor made him think painfully of little Sophie, and he wondered what she was like now that she was growing up, and what kind of woman she would turn out to be, and if he would ever get to know what became of her. He thought he would go back to Germany at that point, but then a man in a local museum asked him if he had ever been to Iceland, and he said he hadn't. So Gregory resupplied himself from Dieter's original man in Copenhagen, and then went back up to Hirtshals, from where a ferry went to Iceland, stopping at the Faroe Islands. The Faroe Islands were the loneliest place that Gregory had yet been to, and as he stood in the whipping wind next to the unfinished ruins of Magnus Cathedral, he half wondered if his heart had been forged here, in this wild, empty, and treeless land, and only then been somehow magically transposed into a body in southern Louisiana. Iceland gave him the exact same feeling. Reykjavik was large enough for Gregory to get by in, almost without constraint, the only problem being that the local populace spent relatively little time outdoors in the streets, but it did not matter much. Gregory could not imagine living in a place where the day was as short as it was here. He bought himself not one, but 2 overpriced imported thick fur pelts, and then hired himself a local driver to take him around. The ocean and cliffs outside of town were breathtaking, and the road from Reykjavik to Höfn was like something from a land of dreams. He saw the geyser at Geysir. He rode in a small tourist boat and saw the floating ice chunks at Jökulsárlón. No one back at Tonle Désiré would ever have believed that a place like this could be part of the same earth as Louisiana. Gregory had never given Iceland any thought at all until he read Jules Verne's Journey to the Center of the Earth, but he had never imagined that he would actually come to see it. Lonely land. I am somehow a part of you, he thought. I understand you. Something inside of my heart understands you completely. He stopped to walk through a herd of Icelandic horses that they found grazing beside the road. They looked up at him with big, calm eyes, fearless of him as no creatures ever were. How strange this country was, and how strange its animals. He then had the driver drive him a ways into the empty Arctic desert interior of the country, told the driver to wait while he walked out, and then he ran about alone for a few hours under the cold, gray sky, chasing an Arctic fox for a while, but purely for sport and not to injure it. How bizarre I must look, this man in a dark gray coat, running through this flat, light gray landscape, he thought. No one was there to see him, or to wonder how it was possible that a man could catch a wild fox running at full speed. The fox had been in such shock when Gregory put his hands around him and lifted him up that he did not even protest, and Gregory stroked him for a few seconds as if he had been a house cat before letting him loose again. The fox streaked across the barren landscape as fast as a beam of light released from a flashlight, and then he was gone. There is more in this world than I have previously realized, thought Gregory. And then he realized that that was exactly the realization that every good voyage should ultimately lead to. What else could even top this? Perhaps it was time to go home. He wrote Dieter a long letter from his hotel back in Reykjavik, and then he took the ferry back to Denmark and dropped the letter into the post there. He spent a week journeying around the Danish countryside, half-heartedly looking for the plantation house from Tonle Désiré, and wondering what it might now look like in its new environs. Had it ever arrived, or had its porch columns ended up at the bottom of the sea, he wondered. Perhaps it was a mercy that it had been hauled away, because it had prevented Gregory from having to watch its inevitable crumbling and decay. He sighed. Having decided to thus end his travels, Gregory flew back to New York, where Wolf waited to welcome him back and to offer him his guest bedroom for his use. Gregory took a long bath, went to the bedroom where he unrolled both of his new fur blankets, and then he rolled himself up in them, bare and damp as he was. He dreamed of running with the Arctic fox again, and then he woke up a few hours later in the dark, curled up into a ball and surrounded everywhere by fur, as if he had somehow found his way into the fox's home and had perhaps become a fox himself. "What will you do now, Gregor?" Wolf asked him in the half-dark hours of early morning, when Gregory had dressed himself and come out to sit in Wolf's exquisitely appointed living room with its magnificent view of town. "Move to Florida, I suppose," Gregory replied vaguely, his mind still partly with the fox in his wide-open Arctic desert terrain. "Yes, but what will you do in Florida? Is your plan to merely sit about and watch the world go by? I'm not at all certain that disconnecting from the world like that is good for creatures like us. In fact, I fear it so much that I continue in my chosen profession as a shopkeeper, in large part to prevent the corrosion of inactivity that I fear comes with disengagement from the world. I will be blunt. I'm worried about you," said Wolf, looking Gregory in the eyes. "You are always worried about me," said Gregory. "That is a sign of things being in their normal state." Wolf gave a wry smile. "That may be, but you still need something to do." "I suppose I could go and see if anyone needs the services of a delivery boy," said Gregory. "No, I was not thinking of that. You are always too good for that. I was thinking you should write. Something more valuable than just your daily life's complaints in your journal, as you tell me you do. I know you enjoy writing, and I can tell from the letters that I have from you that you have some talent. Why not try to use it to create something meaningful?" Wolf suggested. Gregory had never given it all that much thought before, but now it gave him pause. Could he create something meaningful with just a pen and paper? "It's worth considering. When the time will be right," he finally agreed. "Where in Florida will you go?" asked Wolf. "Out on the Gulf side, to the beach where Ferdinand took me. It felt peaceful there," Gregory said. This idea did not end up being realized. Gregory wrote to Ferdinand with his plan, and Ferdinand said that he thought it might be better instead to move to a larger city. Perhaps Miami was a good choice. And then he added that he was tired of Texas after all of these years and could be persuaded to move to Miami as well. So then it became Miami. It took a couple of years to iron it all out. Ferdinand wanted a lavish place in the city, while Gregory wanted a small house out on the beachfront. So they agreed to be city neighbors, if not actual neighbors. The island of Key Biscayne was just being newly developed, and the small, war veteran affordable bungalows that were springing up for sale there suited Gregory just fine. He bought one a few blocks off of the beach and proceeded to fill his days with having his things hauled down from storage up in New York, moving in, and getting his things in order. Certain changes to the home seemed needed, and the place had a small surrounding property that needed a garden put in, so that initially took up Gregory's time. Despite this, every morning he had time for a walk at the beach and an early dawn swim in the ocean, from which he then warmed up at home in his bathtub, all before 8 a.m., so it wasn't too strenuous of an existence. After 6 decades or so, realizing finally that he was the last man of appearance younger than age 60 to still have his head as shiny as a seal's skin, he stopped wearing his de rigueur giant dollop of hair pomade, except a bit right at the front, where the slight waves in his hair threatened to become too unruly during the day. It felt strange to have the wind slightly ruffling his hair again on the sides and in the back, but it felt refreshing, too. "You look good. You look relaxed. The place looks good, too," said Ferdinand as he walked through it and took it all in. "Only why do you have 2 Arctic fur pelts on your bed, Morgan? I dare say, is that really necessary in southern Florida, even for you? I had no idea that you were such a closet, aesthete and sensualist." "No need for you or anyone else to look in my bedroom," Gregory growled, embarrassed, and he walked over and shut the door. He had spent countless decades lying beneath his government-issued, rough-spun soldier's blanket, so to suddenly be accused of being an aesthete was surely unwarranted. He was not frivolous with material things. His new house had 3 small bedrooms, the other 2 being used as a guest room and his study. The entire place was similar in size to his old New Orleans apartment, possibly only slightly larger. His liquor cabinet was in place in the living room, and it was well stocked with Gregory's liquor staples. The beach was a short walk from his front door. He had a good radio and plenty of records. Home sweet home. What more could he need? "You have a nice yard," said Ferdinand, pushing back the curtains and looking out. "Why not get some palm trees and a banana tree?" "Not a bad idea," said Gregory. "I was thinking of getting a hammock, for my busy afternoons." "You're a regular old retiree," Ferdinand laughed. "A small boat, a fishing rod, hideous plaid pants, and a grandpa cap, and you will fully look the part." "I'm exhausted of living just at the moment," said Gregory. "Well, build up your strength, because we want to have all kinds of fun when I move into town," said Ferdinand jovially. It took Ferdinand another year to move into town, but after that, Gregory had someone nearby that he could regularly visit, or at least during the times that Ferdinand was not out of town on an aerial mapping job. The only fly in the ointment was that the only way to get from Key Biscayne to the city was over a causeway that had to be traveled by car. "It is no use fighting it. I will have to get an automobile," thought Gregory resignedly, but he nonetheless put it off for a while and took taxis. Ferdinand patiently taught him to drive, judiciously choosing to make little comment on the fact that Gregory's first car ended up wrapped around a tree inside of 3 weeks. Besides the bother of driving, the warm and sticky Florida environment welcomed him back with open arms, and as a true son of the South, he found that he appreciated it. In this way, first his move, and then the work on his house, and then his learning to drive, kept him busy. It was just as well anyways. There seemed nothing meaningful enough to write about, as Wolf had initially suggested. Gregory quickly discovered that his neighbors were almost all retired couples who had moved there from northern states. As a lone young man living among all of these aged people, Gregory quickly found himself the topic of considerable interest among the retired ladies. But as he rarely left his house and never went grocery shopping or anything like that, his run-ins with other people were relatively infrequent. At the beach, he turned his ruse from Rio on its head and used his small knowledge of Portuguese to pretend to be a Brazilian tourist with a meager knowledge of English. Mostly it worked, and when it didn't, he simply left to go home early, catching the sunset from his backyard hammock. His nearest neighbor was a former postmaster from Tennessee, now retired, and his wife, who played annoying, happy-sounding records over and over again. "It's that pompous horse's arse Frank Sinatra," moaned the retired postman, a heavy-set, balding man with a permanent sunburn, who sometimes fled out into his own backyard with a tumbler in hand, and from where he had seen, in early days before Gregory's fence had gone up, Gregory sitting similarly. "Frank Sinatra? Is he still kicking about? Didn't people used to listen to him during the last war?" asked Gregory uncertainly. "Oh, that man will keep on going until the earth falls into the sun. Ever since she saw him in the movies and then on TV, my wife has become a crazed fan and worships the ground he walks on. This I can say for sure. The more she plays his music, the more I drink." He wiped the Florida evening damp from his brow, and then the two clinked glasses together and drank. "What brings you to this place, then?" he asked Gregory, clearly curious. "My doctor recommended it for my health," Gregory lied, and he could tell from the look that came into the retired postman's eyes that in these few words he had become an ailing cripple worthy of pity. The fact that the man found it so easy to believe made Gregory wonder nervously if he did, in fact, look like something was wrong with him. That had been one of their first conversations. Now, with the fence in place, it was rare that they ran into each other in front of the house and had a drink together, but they did occasionally speak, if never about Gregory's health. Back on his side of the fence, Gregory could not imagine listening to anything as upbeat as Frank Sinatra. Instead, he spent his days playing his Chopin and Mendelssohn records over and over again, and at times, when Wolf called him to let him know in advance, he would tune in to hear the New York Philharmonic or the London Symphony broadcast on the radio. He hated to admit it to himself, but he missed the quality of the theater scene back in New York, and it was hard to move from there to this small island outpost where there was no theater and where he had retired postmen as neighbors. But yet I do belong here, Gregory thought. This is the place for the have-beens. My neighbor used to be a postmaster in Tennessee, but now he is here. I used to be a soldier, but now I am retired from active service. I also used to love a woman named Vivian, but now I, too, have retired. What am I now? An aged beachcomber, seeking nothing but sun and quiet. I am suddenly so old that I can hardly bear to contemplate it. I'm all but obsolete, he thought bitterly. It was getting easier to avoid stray, uncontrolled thoughts of Vivian after all this time, but a few times per month he would still get drunk, and then the barrier he had put between himself and his heart's emotions would temporarily fall, and he would cry, or lie in his bed and speak to her in an audible whisper that seemed to him to be coming from somewhere else than his own mouth. On those times when he was very far gone, he would occasionally pull out her dress that she had once worn to the costume ball, and he would hang it where he could look at it from his sofa, where he would lie lethargically, eyes half closed with drink, and imagine that she was standing in it there before him, more blindingly beautiful than it was even possible for anyone to be. Had she been so radiant, or was his heart drunkenly filling in the gaps in his memory, he wondered. Could she truly have been as wonderful as all that? And how would she look now, so many years later? Time will take her and tear her in half in the end, just like with my blanket, he thought. And then that would break my heart. Wolf finally came down to visit, arriving by hired car, and then walking about the entire place, before finally asking Gregory, "And how much did this rural camp house cost you then? I think my parents' Gärtner had a Gärtner house like this, out back by the edge of the forest." Gregory was going to say something to defend himself, but then he saw from the smile on Wolf's face that he meant it good-naturedly. Then Wolf walked about the inside of Gregory's small house, where he commented on the leafy view and the sunshine. "I like what you have done with the bedroom by adding the furs," he said approvingly, after completing the circuit of the rooms. "It looks comfortable." Oh, heavens! Was his bedroom door left open again? Gregory groaned. His mind was definitely going. "I got those in Iceland," he explained, "and have been using them as a makeshift blanket. since my old blanket ripped. It was a piece of my past, actually. A gift courtesy of the Confederate Army." "The Confederate Army?" echoed Wolf. "As wealthy as you are, you mean to tell me that these 100 years you have been sleeping under some scrap of glorified burlap from your first war?" "Ach yeah, well, I do understand a bit. With us, the moment when we lose, break, or otherwise outlive our material belongings from our original mortal lives is a significant moment. You feel that your ties with your original life are severing, whereas they actually severed years ago. Time stops for no man, or how does the saying go? I grieved terribly when I lost most of the last of my personal mementos in a fire. Did I ever tell you about that?" Gregory shook his head. "It was awful. I thought that I had lost something that made me me. But then I wisely realized that I was not in my things. And anyways, the I that I was now was different than the original acquirer of these items had been." Wolf cleared his throat, then continued. "I believe I read in the newspaper recently that there are only 1 or 2 more veterans still left alive of your glorious war between the states. So I would say that you can safely let it go now, old blanket and all. Everything changes. Take me, for instance. This will surprise you, but I traveled down by plane for the first time." "What?" cried Gregory in disbelief. "You flew?" Wolf made a snorting sound and looked mildly affronted. "I figured that if 2 Johnny-come-latelys, as I believe the expression goes, such as yourself and Ferdinand, had figured this out, then I could make it from New York to Miami via air as well. At least, on some level, we have to keep up with the times, nicht wahr?" His initial shock a bit subsided. Gregory smiled and made a small noise of appreciation, which Wolf pretended not to notice, but Gregory knew that Wolf was glad to get the praise. Wolf's visit came not long after the palm trees had been put into the back and front yards, at the cost of a small fortune, and he seemed impressed, as if Gregory had proven that he was far more capable of handling life than Wolf would have thought possible. But Wolf's biggest shock was that Gregory drove an automobile. "You drive?" he cried, looking appalled. "Yes, I do. Is that a problem in some way?" inquired Gregory. "You just said yourself that we must keep up with the times." By now, Gregory enjoyed driving his convertible, his second and thus far surviving automobile. It gave him the same sweet sensation of wind ruffling his hair and moving against his face that he enjoyed while riding horses or while bicycling. But even beyond enjoyment, the truth was that there was no good way to live on a small residential island and to sustain himself without ready access to the nearby city of Miami, Gregory had quickly discovered. It was either drive a car or move. Wolf did not reply, but only mumbled to himself in German in a low voice, something that sounded like an appeal to heaven, followed by the names of various holy saints, which Gregory knew to be entirely facetious coming from Wolf. Then, after a pause, he said hesitantly, "Gregor, I don't know if you want to know, but someone came by the store to inquire about you. It was some time ago now. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention it on several past occasions with you now, and I was also uncertain if you wanted to know." Gregory shook his head. "I do not want to know." "Is everything all right? Is everyone well?" Well, yes, I think so," said Wolf. "I did not inquire too much myself." "Then if no one needs anything from me, I have no need to know anything further," Gregory said. But even as the words left his lips, he felt the small but powerful, irrational part inside his heart shouting an altogether different opinion. Well, what point was there in hearing anything at all? His logical brain asked. It was best to let sleeping demons lie. If he got to thinking of Vivian again, really thinking about her in a sober frame of mind, he might slip and fall again into that pit of despair, out of which the path was always long and uncertain. Why go through all of that again in his mind? For a while, he wondered if he could find a way to separate the good memories from the hurt, but they were so intricately connected, the one with the other, that he did not have much luck attempting to make this separation. And of course, any memory of her led to the inevitable fact that she was gone, and he was alone. At the beach, he tried to listen to the cries of the seagulls instead, and at home, he listened to music rather than to the voice of his memories regarding her. If anything, he would travel even further back and try to remember his family, his siblings, his mother. But of course, they were all gone too. Turning to the past and looking for a soft place in which to find comfort was futile. Dita came to visit also for a few days, although separately from Wolf. He praised Gregory on having a cozy and well-appointed new home. But then, as the conversation turned to the fine work that his laboratory team was churning out just then, Gregory felt more than a bit ashamed to just spend his days walking the beach, or lying on the sofa listening to music, or resting with his eyes closed in his backyard hammock. Well, he would find something useful to do one day soon, Gregory told himself. He was just resting up for it. That was all. Like Ferdinand had suggested, perhaps they occasionally deserved a decade off. Gregory's lawyer called one day and said that there might be another buyer interested in the remaining land at Tonle-Désiré. But again, Gregory felt that he was not yet ready to sell. The day he sold the last of his family's land would mark the passing of an era, and he would part with the last of his old family home. He couldn't sell the land without riding through it one last time, he thought heartbrokenly. In a world in which nothing else lasted, land would last. He told his lawyer to inform the interested buyer that he was not, after all, ready to sell. Gregory fell into the habit of taking 2 vacations a year, one with Ferdinand back to the Gulf side, to the beach where Ferdinand had first taken him, and then a second vacation alone, to a cold-weather place, which seemed to Gregory a reasonable and refreshing break from his life in Florida. With his handy lunch container in tow, he chartered private flights through Ferdinand and his contacts to the Falkland Islands, the Outer Hebrides, Greenland, Ushuaia, and the northern reaches of Canada, and he saw many amazing sights, but never caught another fox again. As for their trips to the Gulf, Ferdinand at first suggested, "Why not bring dates? Or are you still in your no-women phase, you monk?" "I am," Gregory told him firmly, and after that Ferdinand did not ask again. They chartered sailboats and speedboats, played cards, went to the theater, sat around in local bars where they pretended to drink more than they actually drank, and swam in the ocean. Ferdinand had upgraded his airplane numerous times since Gregory had first flown with him, and his latest model was very sleek indeed. "You should get one of those amphibious planes that lands on water," Gregory suggested. Ferdinand wrinkled up his nose. "That seems awfully silly and frivolous," he said disparagingly. Gregory laughed. "This, coming from a man who owns a rooftop penthouse in Miami and convinced me to buy a luxurious roofless car?" "The penthouse was a necessity," Ferdinand replied with a grin. "You would hardly believe how effective it is with ladies to invite them to come up and look at the stars after an evening out." "It is something to think that you have put your longevity to such excellent use," said Gregory sarcastically. "My map room is also useful in this regard," winked Ferdinand. "I invite my lady friend to sit down and bend her head over my maps, and then I tell her to see if she can find 3 towns that start with the letter S And then, while she is looking, I come behind her and put my arms around her here and kiss her behind her ears." "You're a dangerous beast, Ferdinand," Gregory told him, "and utterly immoral." "Perhaps. But in my spare time between my rendezvous, I have also mapped huge swaths of this continent, so I can't be as bad and useless as all that," Ferdinand said. "Well, all right, but after all these years, I'd think you would have mapped everything by now," Gregory told him. "Aren't you doing it properly?" "Very funny. The technology of maps keeps changing, you know. Now they are talking about satellite navigation. It makes my previous work obsolete, and I have to go up again and take all new measurements and records. So the way I like to think of it is that I'm constantly adding to and maintaining my contributions to society. And speaking of my usefulness," Ferdinand segued smoothly, "this reminds me, Wolf has written to me and asked me if I might help him with something. Something to do with a book." "A book? Why am I not surprised?" said Gregory cynically. "It is some book that he has been after for some time now. Apparently you know of it also." Ferdinand looked over at Gregory. "I can't say that I do," Gregory replied. "If it was something that he recently said to me, forgive me, but with my memory as it is, I don't remember. What is it supposed to be about?" "Something written by some ancient Dutchman or some such thing. It's supposed to be very wise and meaningful, which I am assuming means hopelessly dull and old-fashioned," said Ferdinand. "Something about the nature of time." "Oh, that," said Gregory, a gap appearing in the clouds of his memory. "Yes, now you mention it, I do recall something about that. At one point he traveled out west to some collector's estate sale to see if he could get this book, but it did not come to pass." "Wanting a book on the nature of time. Can you imagine? At this point, I would think that Wolf could probably write that book himself." "Yeah, I've always wondered about that. How old is he, Morgan?" Ferdinand asked. Gregory shrugged. "I don't know for certain. We have never spoken of it together. I think he once mentioned meeting Mozart or some such thing, so he must be at least that old. I figure if he had wanted me to know, he would have told me directly. He is very private about his past." "A strange relationship the two of you have, then, where hardly anything serious can be spoken of directly." Gregory flinched at the criticism in Ferdinand's tone. "Oh, I don't know about that. We speak of serious things sometimes. But now what about this book? Does he think he knows where it is once more?" Gregory could already tell where this conversation was going. Wolf wanted Gregory to run about and look for this book. If it has turned up again, now that he has overcome his resistance to flying, why can't he go after it himself? "Wait until I tell you where he wants us to go, then you will know," said Ferdinand, already rolling his eyes. "Have you heard of the oriental city of Lhasa? It's in Tibet, one of the highest altitude places in the world. And as if that were not enough, there is a war brewing there with the Chinese. I know you do not follow the news at all, but they recently invaded the place." "Tibet? What on earth would somebody want with the ancient scribbles of some medieval Dutchman in Tibet?" asked Gregory. Apparently, the scribbles that the Dutchman noted down were based on what he had heard from an ancient Tibetan wise man, so a present-day Tibetan monk sought to acquire the book and return it and its wisdom back to a monastery in Tibet, explained Ferdinand. Gregory shifted uneasily in his seat. Something was off here. And now the monks have looked in it, confirmed they don't want it after all, and it is for sale again? Well, not exactly, said Ferdinand. And this is why I have taken no action on this request of Wolf's thus far. He has it on rumor which monastery this book is in, and he wants us to go and make a financial offer in exchange for the book. He sighed. As if Wolf believed it likely that a bunch of worldless monks would want his money. It is a fool's errand, grumbled Ferdinand. My vote is that we tell Wolf that we will not undertake this journey. I wholeheartedly agree, said Gregory. But if there was one thing that Ferdinand could as little resist as a beautiful woman. It was the lure of fascinating new undertakings, and it had clearly kept rattling around in his brain, because a few weeks later, he admitted that he had been looking at maps of the Tibetan plateau. "It is insane! I have no idea how we would even get there," insisted Ferdinand. "I thought we decided that we would not go," Gregory reminded him. Ferdinand disregarded this, shifted his yo-yo out of the way from where he had laid it on the map, and pointed with his finger. "Look, here is the most accessible airstrip, and here's the direction for the flight path in. It is sheer madness." "You mean you could not fly us there if we were to go?" asked Gregory. It was a purely theoretical question. "Morgan, my plane is not engineered to fly from here to Asia, and it most certainly is not engineered to fly up into the Himalayas. The winds could shave my wings right off, or we would experience engine failure, or get so dizzy from the thin air that we could not hope to pilot properly, even creatures like us. We would end up crashed or stranded on the side of some sheer, snowy mountain, with nary an animal or man about, and then where would we be? No book is worth that." Ferdinand shivered. "No, this would require a different kind of aircraft. I wonder if my contacts from the war might be able to connect me to someone with a suitable military plane." "I thought we were not going," Gregory repeated again. Ferdinand looked up from his maps. "What, are you busy?" "Well, no, but I thought we agreed that this was a fool's errand," said Gregory. "Yes, as far as the book goes, it probably is. But to see the Himalayas, just imagine, us two old-time Southern boys, flying to the highest capital on earth. Oh, the stories that we could tell." Ferdinand's eyes glistened. He walked over to a cabinet, opened it, and pulled out a pair of handguns. The sight of weapons made Gregory feel ill. "Would we have to take guns, Ferdinand? This is just like going to war." Ferdinand grinned. "No. War is when my government asks me to go and do it. When I choose it on my own, it is adventure." And that was how, about 4 months later, after landing first in Nepal, a pasty-faced Gregory found himself strapped in beside Ferdinand, while a Russian pilot named Flip, or Fleep as he pronounced it, took them over the peaks of the Himalayas. Gregory did not know exactly why Flip was nicknamed Flip, but he hoped they would not have to find out. Ferdinand was craning his head all but out the window in his attempt to see everything that there was to see, and it was clear that he was awestruck by the sights, visible here and there between the briskly moving cover of clouds. Gregory, meanwhile, was thinking how eager he suddenly was for them not to crash. For someone who often theoretically wondered if his life had any meaning and if he should bother to go on, one whiff of real fear suddenly showed him clearly where his true loyalties lay. "Fine weather you gentlemen have," Flip shouted back to them in his thick accent over the roar of the engines. Is he being facetious? Asked Gregory. The wind was whipping them about like a kite on a string. It's hard to be sure, admitted Ferdinand. Look, I'm just glad that we were able to find anyone fool enough to try to fly us in. Wolf's forged papers from his Chinese associate had better work when we land, or else the weather, metaphorically speaking, will heat up. I can't believe I let you talk me into this, moaned Gregory. But Wolf did not fail them, and whatever was in the papers met the grudging approval of the military official whose job it was to sit at the airstrip. There was no airport. There was nothing that looked like traces of civilization. Gregory clutched their luggage tighter, realizing that their continued existence likely depended on it in this arid northern wasteland. They had just managed to fly into a country that few planes could reach, and that even fewer foreigners were able to enter. What exactly had Wolf asked to have put into that letter? The Chinese military official was hardly a warm welcoming committee, but his face briefly brightened at the sight of the contents of a second envelope that Ferdinand handed him. That envelope did not contain a letter, Gregory knew. They waited around on the dusty plateau, under a strangely bright yet cold sun, until a small, dark-skinned local man appeared and told them in broken French that they should follow him. Ferdinand showed him their second letter, addressed to the head of the monastery near Lhasa, a monastery with an unpronounceable name, where the book was thought to be. The local man gave a furtive, scared look in the direction of the military official, and then hid the letter inside of his traditional leather overcoat. This must be the strangest place that I have ever visited, Gregory said in a low voice to Ferdinand. I told you that this would be adventure worth having, Ferdinand replied with a smile. The entire 10-day visit was in a similar vein. Gregory and Ferdinand stayed with the local man and his family, which was extremely uncomfortable and odd. The smell of soot and food smells mingled with the smell of the inhabitants, which made it difficult for Gregory and Ferdinand to feel at ease. The fact that their meals were coming out of a cold case that Ferdinand had procured from somewhere only made them long all the more for something warmer. The local man's wife gave Gregory and Ferdinand very suspicious looks, and Gregory felt certain that if she were Catholic, she would be crossing herself every time their paths crossed. It made him wonder whether these primitive, superstitious people could sense things about him that his neighbors and countrymen back in the more advanced world could not. It was an unsettling thought, and briefly Gregory was reminded of a run-in with a bothersome fortune-telling gypsy, although where that had been he could no longer say with certainty. Had Vivian been there too? Well, if yes, then there was no need to think further in that direction. He did not want to know. Do you remember the injured men during the war, stuffed into that small enclosed space with us in the airplane? Gregory asked Ferdinand, as the two of them sat on their piles of blankets and furs in the dirt floor home and stared into the dark of the tiny room that they had been given for their use. If this was how the educated foreign speakers and their families lived, it was hard to even imagine how the other residents of Lhasa might live. The palace of the Dalai Lama was far away in the distance, and in the night gloom, a long line of small and battered-looking roofs of other dwellings separated their window from it. It was awful, traveling with the bleeding, moaned Ferdinand, and this is hardly any better. I don't understand why we have to wait for some auspicious day to leave for the monastery. If these people make us wait a whole lot longer, I'm not sure how auspicious it will be for anyone. Gregory looked over at Ferdinand in the gloom. The idea came into his mind again, whether the same woman had not factored in both of their histories to make them such as they now were, hungry and unchanging. In those years after the war in the South, How many such creatures could there have possibly been, after all? He was on the verge of opening his mouth and asking his friend, when he realized he did not want to know. Like two men who had both been lovers of the same woman, there was really nothing on the topic that anyone would want to put out loud into words. So Gregory hesitated, and then the moment passed, and Ferdinand changed the subject. At last the day came, and they got underway to the monastery. Their host had hired an additional guide for them, who had apparently suggested that they travel with some pack animals, but there was no animal that would go anywhere with Ferdinand or Gregory without putting up a fight, so in the end they all went only on foot. It was terrain that made Gregory grateful that he had heeded Ferdinand's advice and had purchased suitable clothing and footwear. His shined-up urban street shoes would have given out within the first hours on these rocks. At last they arrived at the monastery. Gregory had imagined something like the elegant stone cloisters of the European monks, but this turned out to be a very impoverished and ancient-looking pile of stone set on top of a smaller mountain. They entered, and their host and translator asked them in his broken French to wait in an empty antechamber. He returned shortly to tell Gregory and Ferdinand that the head monk was still at his prayers, and they would have to wait. Then he left again. Gregory was curious to look about. It was as if an invisible force was drawing him out of the room and into the corridor. "Go look about," Ferdinand told him. "I will stay here with the guide and guard our supplies. If these take up legs and go anywhere, we are sunk." Gregory nodded his thanks. "Please don't forget yourself and play with the yo-yo," he said. "I think that they are smarter around here than in the West, and probably know what that is really for, and I would imagine that they are not very accepting of weapons." With that, he slipped out of the room. The place was cold, and clearly very, very ancient. The walls of the place were visibly crumbling, and long cracks ran along the entire corridor. At its end was another heavy door, behind which was a corridor that was in much better shape, painted in bright colors, and lined with a colorful, if threadbare, carpet. And this corridor opened out onto what had to be the central square shrine. Gregory hesitated a moment, then removed his shoes and left them beside what had to be the sandals of praying monks. He removed his hat, and he pushed through the door and stepped inside. The door banged awkwardly behind him. It took a moment for his eyes to adjust to the deep darkness, but then he could easily see in full detail the painted wooden beams which decorated the ceiling, and the elaborate drapes which hung between the red pillars. Here and there, monks in red and yellow robes sat on cushions on the floor, but they looked to be deep in their prayers and did not look up at Gregory. He found a small cushion on the floor near to the door and sat down on it, awkwardly folding his long legs under him, fully aware that he was probably the tallest man to ever have sat on it. The air was thick and heavy, with the smell of smoke and incense. It was wonderful, because it masked the scent of the shrine's other inhabitants, which after all of this travel and constrained circumstances were an increasing temptation to Gregory. Here in this darkness, I can be free of longing, he thought suddenly. How wonderful, and how rare. His eyes took in the sculptures on the altar, and all of the offering bowls and flowers and incense sticks smoldering about the seated Buddha, and he wondered what it would have been like to have been born here, far from the reach of papal Rome. What would his beliefs be, and how would he have lived to be in accordance with them? He tried to imagine being the husband of a local woman, face leathered rough by the wind and sun, with a small dirt floor home packed with hungry children. And now these people were perhaps considering going to war against the Chinese. From what he had seen since he had arrived, it was plenty evident that these people had no chance. He thought to say a prayer for them all, but suddenly he could not call to mind the words of any prayers. So he just sat there, and as he did, a pleasant drowsiness took over, and he felt himself vanishing into the collective prayers and calm of the interior of the shrine. And then suddenly, it seemed to him as if Vivian stood beside him, closer than he had felt her to be in years, as if he had never lost her trust, and as if she was standing there and smiling down on him and blessing him. He bowed his head, overcome with feeling. It was like being forgiven at last. Gregory did not want to leave when the guide came to pull on his sleeve and indicated that it was time to go. The head monk was an old man with a very dignified appearance. Their local host handed Ferdinand's letter to the monk's associate, who passed it on to the head monk with some explanation, followed by a seated bow forward over folded hands. The head monk handed the letter to a younger monk beside him, and the younger monk read it to him, while the head monk listened, with his eyes closed. Gregory wondered if this was a sign of the head monk's authority, or if he simply could not read. After the letter had been read, there was silence, as they all sat and waited for the head monk's reply. He seemed to be praying or resting, but then after a few minutes he opened his eyes, turned to his assistant, and sent him off on an errand. Their local host and translator indicated to Ferdinand and Gregory that they should wait. After a few minutes, the assistant returned, holding something wrapped in crimson fabric. He handed it to his master and bowed low. The head monk took the bundle and laid it on the low table between them. Gregory held his breath, and even Ferdinand appeared to take interest as he leaned forward. The head monk respectfully folded back the cloth wrapping, and inside was a smallish, dark leather volume. The head monk opened the cover, and inside, in very old printing, on very aged yellow paper, was written a title that Gregory thought might translate from Belgian French to something like A Discourse on the Nature and Purpose of Time. The name Pieter van Aert, Antwerp followed, and at last the year 1612. Almost without thinking, Gregory reached out his hand. The head monk put his arm out over the ancient book. He said something in a low, authoritative voice that Gregory gathered must have meant, "Ask the visitors if this is the book that they are looking for," because their translator and host asked Gregory and Ferdinand if this was indeed the volume. Gregory confirmed that it was. The head monk looked closely at Gregory and Ferdinand, and then he spoke for perhaps a minute, the most that he had said since they had come into his presence. He ended his remarks with a short, loud laugh. Their host translated into his poor French. Dites-leur qu'ils sont reconnus. Tell them I know what they are. They are different from us. Why do they come asking for this book? It is a book of wisdom, and... Here the translator faltered. Do they pray? What need do such creatures have of this book? They do not live pinched, pensé, by time. We need this book, not them. Gregory felt his blood run cold. It was never pleasant to be exposed by a stranger, and it sharply increased the odds that violence and a near escape might have to follow. He had always thought of Oriental monks as peaceful and calm, but maybe their compassion did not extend to the likes of himself or Ferdinand. It was clear that the head monk did not mean to give them the book. Ask him if we might look at it at least, having come all this way, Gregory said to their host. He translated their request, to which the head monk nodded, and said that he would give them half an hour with it, but that they needed to be careful with it. He stood up, at which they all stood up, and then everyone bowed over prayer-folded hands to everyone else, and at last they all walked out, leaving Gregory and Ferdinand alone. Ferdinand reached for the small, battered leather volume. A multi-lifelong obsession with this one object, he muttered. And I had always thought of Wolf as the pinnacle of reason. Well, I suppose we all have our irrational desires. Now, what exactly is in here? Is it some kind of French? It is, said Gregory, taking the fragile volume from Ferdinand. As his fingers turned the pages, a fine dust seemed to rise up and hang in the air, its motes visible in the sunlight. Look, here is a section on the effects of time, and here is another on the purpose of time, and here is one on the origins of time. I wish it was not so difficult to read the old-style letters and the phrasing. Ferdinand pulled his fingers through his hair, pulled his yo-yo out of his pocket, and stared absent-mindedly, running it up and down along its string. Well, have at it then, and get Wolf his money's worth out of this half-hour. I, for one, am eager to be gone from this place. These monks give me the shakes. I do rather think... But Gregory no longer paid Ferdinand any attention. He was lost in the perusal of the book. Wolf's long-sought-after tome about time. If only he could have more time to properly look at it, he thought, realizing how ironic that was. He moved through page upon page. The prologue explained how the author had met with a foreign wise man, probably a Buddhist monk, and had learned all of what followed. The rest of the book was a mix of exotic ideas about the nature of time. Here, Van Aert seemed to suggest that time did not flow as everyone supposed. There, he seemed to suggest that animals and nature might even be able to exist without time, but that man required it most desperately. There were labeled diagrams of what might either be the cosmos or could just as easily be the inside of an orange. There was a section devoted to something mysterious called ether time, and it was followed by a drawing of a man sitting with his eyes closed and with his legs folded up under him, which reminded Gregory of himself just a short while earlier in the monk's temple. Some kind of a talisman or star was drawn in the center of the man's forehead. Gregory moved on. Van Aert seemed to be saying that mankind needed time, so as to be able to seek holiness. Well, perhaps the monk was right. That did not seem to apply very much to someone unchanging. Well, what need do we have to seek holiness, creatures such as we are? Another turn of the page yielded a picture of what looked like many small squiggly lines or worms spread across both sheets of paper. There were references everywhere to divine God. Gregory forgot the monastery, forgot Tibet, and lost himself in contemplation of this strange volume. If he could read all of this and understand it, what great wisdom could be his? A scraping sound at the door startled him, and then in walked the head monk and his assistant, followed by Ferdinand, with their guide and their translator. Had 30 minutes already gone by? Gregory looked outside and saw that the light was different now. He had no idea how much time had passed, but it had been more than half an hour. The head monk had been generous. Gregory placed the book back in its wrappings and attempted to pull the fabric about it again, but the head monk gestured with his hand for him to stop, probably because he was bungling the job. Instead, the leading assistant monk completed the job of rewrapping the volume. "Tell him I thank him deeply for his generosity," said Gregory to their host, who conveyed the same to the head monk. The head monk smiled, then spoke, which their host translated back. The gist of it was something like, "You are welcome. I hope you have found what you came here to seek." The monk's expression changed to become harder. "Now leave this place. I would not have any of my community harmed." "Tell him we intend no harm to anyone," said Ferdinand hurriedly. "Please tell him we are ready to depart." The head monk was satisfied with this reply, indicated that he was going to impart a blessing, and then the assistant translated the words of his blessing. "May you be wise in your long years. May you find ways to reduce harm to living creatures. May peace find you as it is able, and may you find your purpose as we seek here for ours. The light of the always, infinite, unseen, reaches into every corner of creation, although you may think that you stand in shadow. May you also find the light as you are able to see it." Awed, Gregory pulled out his pocket notebook before he could even stop himself, and he quickly jotted down what the monk had said. Then the assistant stood up and took the book away, and then everyone bowed low to everyone else, and Ferdinand gave the head monk a gift of an inscribed golden bowl, which Wolf had provided to them in support of their journey. The monk bowed low in thanks, but did not touch it. It remained behind on the table as they all emptied out of the room. Out in the corridor, the head monk motioned to Gregory. "He is asking for you to come closer, to speak with you," explained the translator to Gregory in his poor French. "Yes," Gregory said, stepping closer. The head monk gave Gregory a long, deep look. Then he spoke. When he finished, his hand reached into his robes and pulled something out that he then handed to Gregory. It was a long necklace of beads, with a tassel hanging off the end of it. "What is this?" asked Gregory, awed. "He says he saw you earlier in prayer," translated their host into feeble French. "He asks if you are a kind of monk also. He says he believes you will return here, but he will be away. deceased by then. He gives you this gift. "Thank you most kindly," said Gregory, bowing as he had seen the others do. "What is it?" "They are prayer beads. He wishes to give you a special prayer. Blessing." "Lower your head," said their host. Gregory did as he was told, and the head monk spoke a few lines in Tibetan over him. "Who would know me for what I am and bless me none the less? Not once, but twice in a single afternoon," thought Gregory. He could not believe it. He felt incredibly humbled, and he turned away quickly to hide the glimmer that he knew had come into his eyes. "That old monk was pretty poetic at the end there," said Ferdinand, as they strapped themselves back in for the return flight, while Flip stepped out to confer with a very understaffed ground crew. "Who knows? Maybe there is something to it all. I wish I could remember exactly what he said. It sounded so holy at the time." "I wrote it down," said Gregory. "Here, I can write out a quick copy for you." And so he did, tearing the small page loose from his notebook and handing it to his friend. Ferdinand perused the words. "Wow, may peace find us as it is able to, eh? Who wouldn't want that? I will keep this. It seems improbably consoling, given what we have become, but some kind of holiness does seem to come from off of it. Who couldn't use some blessing, after all?" He folded up the paper and put it in his suit jacket. Their unlikely trip had been an amazing experience from beginning to end. Only Ferdinand came out of it with some disappointment when he discovered when they returned home that he had inadvertently left his beloved yo-yo behind. Gregory told him to take it as a sign that it was time to evolve and move on. Rereading it all now, revisiting that almost incredible journey, following along in the pale lamplight in the early morning Florida hours, the feeling of blessing came over him afresh, and he wondered what the monk had meant when he said that Gregory would return there one day. It was certain that it would not happen again for some time. After their return, Ferdinand had told Gregory that he had told someone else that he had recently been to Tibet, and that the person he was speaking to was shocked and in disbelief. "No one can get into Tibet these days," Ferdinand was told. "Why, they don't even have an airport there." It made Gregory wonder all over again how they had ever gotten in, and if perhaps it had not all been a dream. Wolf was also in disbelief when Gregory told him that he had seen the book, and it appeared to be a spiritual treatise of some kind. "But Van Aerts was a logical mind, an early scientist, a Renaissance scholar," Wolf began, confused. "Yes, who happened upon a Buddhist monk, who shared with him all kinds of spiritual knowledge regarding the nature of time," Gregory finished for him. "It is probably good that the book has gone to a monastery, as it probably takes a monk to understand it." Wolf looked crestfallen. "Ach, Gregor, you have no idea how disappointing this is," he sighed. "Strange. I feel enlightened," Gregory had told him. Wolf did not mention the book again. The years marched on, until one day Gregory got a happy call from Wolf informing him that Dieter had agreed at last to move to America for a while. His laboratory was in particularly good order at the moment, and he thought that they could carry on without him for a few years, so he was ready to begin his off-decade of behind-the-scenes involvement only. Although a resident of a large city himself for these many years, Dieter was overwhelmed by the American-style bustle of Manhattan, and he was not accustomed to living in a high-rise building without so much as a small patio or garden, so he had persuaded Wolf to move to the wider city environs, where they could presumably be convenient neighbors. They had decided on White Plains. Wolf wanted to know if he could count on Gregory's help to move the store, but Gregory knew that Wolf was perfectly capable of moving the store all on his own, so he suspected that Wolf wanted Gregory about more for friendship and support during the move than for any other reason. As old as we are, we find transition harder than most creatures, thought Gregory. After how many years would we come to be fully adapted to change and no longer be unsettled by it, he wondered. Gregory was happy to fly up and help Wolf in any way that he could, and he did not hesitate to get himself on a flight to New York a few weeks later. The city had changed since Gregory had lived in it, and that had only been a decade ago. New buildings had sprung up, and women's hemlines had inched higher. It was impossible to look in any direction and not be struck by the massive impact of the passage of time. But no evidence of the passage of time could have been more stark than the moment when a beautiful, blonde-haired girl walked into the bookstore asking for him, and he discovered that it was Sophie. Wolf, no fool, had figured it out at once, and he gave Gregory a look complete with sharply raised, bushy eyebrows. But no power on earth could have kept Gregory from speaking with Sophie once she slid the photo of herself as a small child across the counter to him. "Yes, Sophie, I know you," he said, a mess of emotions rising up in his throat. When had she grown so tall and so womanly and lovely? Time does not only take and destroy, he thought. It also ripens the unripe fruit and allows blossoms to open, petal by petal. He knew he was staring at her and tried to look away to keep her from noticing. She looked like Chip, but she also looked a lot like her mother at this age, young and impressionable, and still believing in the goodness of life. And then this thought brought the Vivian of age 16 freshly to mind in a level of detail that he would not have believed his lousy memory capable of. "I fall in love with you all over again," he thought to himself. Sophie told him that she was 14, an admission which made Gregory feel approximately 500 years old. "Oh, beautiful one," he thought, "I recall when your mother was about as old. Still, 14 is very, very young to look so perfect in every way," he thought. He suddenly wanted to know everything about her, and most especially about Vivian, how they were doing, and if Vivian had found happiness with another. He half hoped she had, and the other half of him hoped just as ardently that she hadn't. He shouted to Wolf that he was going out for a bit, and then walked Sophie to a nearby cafe, where he sat dazzled by the incredibly beautiful sight of her in the bright light of the sunny afternoon, as she told him about her life with her mother and grandmother. Sophie told him that her mother had not remarried, but occasionally went out to dinner or the movies with a gentleman friend. So maybe she had moved on. His heart dropped into his socks. Well, he had not moved on. He never went out with any ladies. "I have been faithful to thee, Sinara, in my fashion," he thought, quoting Ernest Dowson's famous, and to Gregory also well-loved, refrain. He had so many things that he wanted to ask Sophie, that he realized it would take a longer time to get through them all. They agreed on another appointment later in the week. "Gregor, I know who that is," Wolf told him after Gregory returned to the store. "Leave her alone. I advise you well." "What is the harm in speaking with her a few times?" asked Gregory. I fly back to Florida in 3 more weeks. How much harm could I possibly inflict around here in that time? I just want to talk to her and ask her about her family." "You want to ask her about her mother," said Wolf, making a you-can't-fool-me face. "Well, and so what is the harm in that? We are old family friends," Gregory replied. "Ah, Gregor, there is no talking sense to you. This is a young girl now, and not the baby of your memories. You have made this mistake before. This could end badly," Wolf countered. "You worry too much, Wolf," Gregory told him. "Now let's finish with these boxes, so that we are not late for our evening at the ballet with Dieter." The ballet was brilliant, but Gregory's mind was far away. What would it be like to see Vivian after all of these years? What would it be like to speak to her, to be near her once again, for any amount of time? What did she look like? What had 10 years done to her beauty? Loyally, Gregory could not imagine any touches of the passage of time that would make him love Vivian any less. Yes, there had been pain and disappointment, but it was all so long ago now. Perhaps there was something that could be salvaged, even after all of this time. At their next visit, after Gregory had pummeled Sophie with 1,000 different questions, he started to tell her about his memories of his time with her and her mother. His journals were back in his house in Florida, but he told her what he remembered, and she glowed like an ember and smiled brilliantly at each of his anecdotes. Oh, but it was lovely to sit with her and feel her child's adoration and her intense attention. And even beyond that, the thrill of being so very close suddenly to a living piece of Vivian. They agreed to meet again. Wolf frowned more and more deeply every time that Gregory returned from an outing with Sophie. At his hotel room, Gregory propped up the photograph that she had given him of the two of them, and he lay on his bed, lost in reverie. He was thinking how to figure out if Vivian would see him, but for reasons he could not even put into words, he did not want to put the question directly to Sophie. It seemed too presumptuous, and the thought of being rejected was too horrible to contemplate. What made Wolf so worried, Gregory wondered. Anyone could see how happy Sophie was to be spending time with Gregory. There seemed to his mind to be nothing wrong, right up until the moment that Sophie tore, weeping, through the store's front door and told him that she loved him. Wolf loudly cleared his throat and declared that he was suddenly urgently needed elsewhere and would be back in an hour, and then he left the store, leaving Gregory with a tear-streaked young girl to whom he had once been a pseudo-father. "Sophie, sit down," he said, leading her gently around the counter and to a chair. "I have known you since you were a very little girl, and I have long come to think of you with the affection of a father, but that is the only kind of affection that I can imagine with you. Moreover, I am flying back home in a few more days, so I am not certain when we will see each other again. I understand that at 14, things are confusing sometimes, but do think of me more as a family friend, if you can." Sophie was not to be comforted. So you will not take me away and marry me?" she asked between sobs. "I hardly think that would be right," he replied gently. "What would your mother say? And to be married at 14 to whoever it may be is a terrible idea." "I will be older soon, if you can wait for me," she cried, wiping at her face. He sighed. "Sophie, dearest, it is not a matter of waiting. It is a matter of... Well, really, it is a matter of many things, but it is also a matter of loving another." As the words left his lips, he wanted to recall them. This was a bad line of argument to have brought up. Better to have stuck to the suitability, age, and lack of interest arguments. Ah, well. Is it my mother that you love? Sophie asked suddenly. Why, Gregory flailed, at a loss for words. Is she the one you love? Sophie asked again, her voice stronger and an impassioned gleam coming into her eye. There was no point in prevaricating. Everything that was ever going to break had already broken. Nothing of value was left in this world. He took a deep breath. Yes, she is the one I love. And you met with me so that you could ask me about her, sniffed Sophie. She may have been only 14, but she certainly was quick-witted. Well, yes, but I also wanted to get to know you a bit. You and your mother and I, we were a sort of inseparable trio at one point, and I had come to love you also, as I said, like a father. His voice trailed off beneath her accusing gaze. Did you leave us then? Asked Sophie. What to say, he wondered. Your mother threw me out, hardly seemed the chivalrous thing to reply. So he said, Yes, I did, and it has not been without deep regret. Sophie was silent for a moment, then said, My mother is too old for you, Mr. Morgan. Gregory felt like someone had taken a small, sharp utensil to his heart and was tapping away at it. It may seem that way, I can understand that, but love is not a logical thing, Sophie. I only know how it is, not whether it makes sense, or how it perhaps should be. And I do love her. Now smile, wipe off your tears, and go home. A wonderful future awaits you, and a wonderful husband and family of your own. Go and be happy. If I could, I would see to it that you got every blessing in this world. Instead of crying less, Sophie cried harder. He thought to reach over and put an arm about her, but he realized that that would probably not be helpful under the circumstances. Instead, he said, Listen, I have a request to make of you. Could you take the following message to your mother for me? Tell her not to suffer, and if she is still suffering, that I have forgiven her. Tell her to put her heart at peace, and that I do not hold anything against her, no matter what was in the past. Can you do this for me? It would be doing me a big favor. Sophie looked up at him, tears streaking down her face, as had so often been the case with her mother, and the way her lips were stubbornly set was the spitting image of Vivian in her younger days. He thought she was considering making a reply, but then she suddenly stood up and dashed out of the store, blushing and crying. The surprise delayed his reaction time, and it took a while before he reached the front door. Sophie, come back here, he called after her into the street. But she was already far down the sidewalk, and in another moment or two she was gone. Wolf arrived a few moments later. Ah, Gregor, sighed Wolf. When will you finally learn that no woman older than age 10 can actually resist you? Vivian has not remarried, Gregory said, ignoring Wolf. Perhaps if I write to her again, she might see me. Perhaps if I ask her to see me. Gregor, you're not listening to me, said Wolf more firmly. Stop trying to get, at all costs, what you think you want. Look at me. That distraught and sobbing child that raced out of here and collided with me on the sidewalk just now lives with Frau Vivian. Would you go and cause any more problems for them? Look at how things have gone thus far. You need to leave Frau Vivian alone, at least while her young daughter still lives with her. But too much time has passed already, cried Gregory. I don't know what I've been waiting for all this time, but I've just realized that in Vivian's world, a decade is a very long time. If I wait any longer, she might be with another." "As she should be!" cried Wolf. "It cannot be helped. You cannot run back into her world right now. It would be truly evil. It would be infinitely harmful to her daughter. You cannot even consider it. Show some selflessness and some sense, and leave them alone for another decade at least." "Another decade?" cried Gregory. "But in another decade—" Wolf cut him off. "Oh, where have I heard this before? Kindly stop acting as if the entire world was about you and your feelings. Either the time will be right then, or it will not. But that is in the hands of fate. Resign yourself to it. You may not be as mortal as some, but you are still subject to many of the same laws of nature. For once, take my advice and accept things as they are, and wait. Sometimes that is the best way left to us to prove our affections." Gregory flew home, badly shaken. Sophie's misery appeared to have infected him and reignited afresh his own inner unhappiness, and he could not get back any more the small bit of calm that he had once discovered back in Rio. Speaking with Wolf also left him feeling rebuked and chastened. The only remaining service that Gregory thought he could usefully render to either Sophie or to Vivian was to light one of his few remaining wishing candles for each of them, and to offer prayers for them to be happy, and to find other people to be with if they so wished, so that they would not remain alone or unhappy forever because of him, and because of the way that he had interfered with their lives. Perhaps it was time to let things go. In this frame of mind, when his lawyer wrote once again, a few months later, that another, even more lucrative offer had come for the remaining land at Temps-le-Désiré, Gregory discovered that there was no fight left in him, and he agreed to sell. "Have I learned nothing at all?" he thought bitterly to himself. "Either I give things up willingly, or time will just tear them out of my hands anyways, sooner or later. Blankets tear, metal corrodes, babies grow up into confused adolescents, and everything is swept away by the tide of time. What part of me could still call Temps-le-Désiré home? Not even the Mullins are there anymore. Not even Tom. What would be there for me but pain? Let someone else have it." He pulled out his old key to the house and held it in his hands for a long time, trying to figure out what was the right thing to do. And in the end he decided that if all he wanted was a nostalgic memento, the key could serve just as well as a property that he never visited anyways. He went to the attorney's office, signed the papers, and went home to an anti-celebratory bourbon. Alaska officially became a new state, and Ferdinand got swept up in numerous lengthy new projects, flying over its cold, wild landscape and updating heretofore sparsely detailed maps, so he was often away, and Gregory was suddenly alone more than he had been in many years. He walked along the ocean, or lay in his hammock and his bed in Key Biscayne, and thought about time, and how it galloped ever on. Wars came and went, friends came and went, new states came to be. Things broke and then turned to dust. Time could take everything away, but Gregory would not let it have his memories. He looked at the large number of volumes in the locked cabinet in his study now, and the others beneath his bed. This was his treasure trove, where he hoarded the past and kept it safe from the destructive fingers of progress, where his heart went to find its way out of its troubles, and where his past loves were forever kept immortal in all of their brilliant glory. Why map Alaska when he had this? The map of his entire heart, and where it had gone, and how it had been, and what he had felt, and how much he had loved her. And then, as he was running his fingers along their spines, he realized that, although she may have Sophie, and her mother, and her job in New York, and her fairy-like radiance, Vivian did not have this. She had the memories that a normal person might hold on to from days gone by, but she had nothing this thorough, the entire archive of their interactions together. It was all so beautiful, beloved, he thought, closing his eyes. Even the parts that hurt, even the various betrayals and misunderstandings that came between us. It was all perfect and involved my complete heart. And I'm proud of this love, he suddenly realized. Despite all his denials, the splinter was not all the way out yet, and it might never be. Something had changed in him since he had tried to reassert his independence of her in Rio, when he swore to himself that he wouldn't come any more when she called. She hadn't called, so he had never had the opportunity to prove his new determination to himself. But now that the rebellious fire in him had subsided, he knew he loved her still, passionately, and to the full capacity and depth of his heart. He looked down at his journals again. Did Vivian, too, have a right to this treasure trove of the past, Gregory wondered? Or was it too painful to share after all of this time, and would it only make her unhappy? What was the right thing to do? He thought about it for a few weeks, then went into downtown Miami to buy himself a typewriter and paper supplies. And then he sat down in his study and pulled out all of the journals that were tied about with a thin red ribbon, all of the ones that he had not dared to open and look at too closely in these many years. And he began to read, and then, pouring himself a glass of wine, he began to type, making her a copy. The project ended up taking him almost a year to complete.